All right, gang, so our topic for today is the Clean Air Act. Now, guys, we don't want to go specifically straight through the Clean Air Act. That would be a very uninteresting lecture if we just covered kind of the regulations associated with the Clean Air Act. So I need to give you an overview of the Clean Air Act, but we specifically want to talk about using property rights to improve air quality, because we've seen some interesting innovations in the Clean Air Act. So if we just look at the legislation, it may not seem all that interesting. I don't find it all that interesting until we look at some innovations. The innovations that have been embedded into the Clean Air Act are interesting. All right? So please understand, for those of you that maybe have a really good background in the Clean Air Act, you guys may have covered it in your environmental studies class, but we're going to cover it maybe a slightly different way. And maybe you already all know this or not. So, first thing we need to know about the Clean Air Act is that we're talking about comprehensive legislation that was passed in 1970. So guys, I don't know if that means the Clean Air Act is old. From your perspective, it probably seems like that's old, right? And somebody born in 1970, right, would be 49 years old as I record this lecture. But to me, that doesn't seem that old, right? That just doesn't seem that old, that we didn't have this sweeping legislation in one place until 1970. So, a comprehensive federal law passed in 1970. Now, when we look at the Clean Air Act, we need to understand that it's regulating emissions from both mobile and stationary sources of pollution. So, if we were in environmental class, we'd be talking about that there are really two sources of pollution, right? We have mobile sources. Guys, what might be some mobile sources of pollution? Mobile sources of pollution. Cars, right? Cars is a great example of a mobile source of pollution. And a stationary source might be what? Factories. All right. So, the Clean Air Act addresses both mobile and stationary sources of pollution. And guys, this is a wordy lecture. You're not going to want to write word for word for word, or you will be here all day. All right? But you do need to make sure you understand, if I talk about mobile sources of pollution, what I'm talking about, and if I'm talking about stationary sources of pollution, you understand what I'm talking about. Now, one very important part of the Clean Air Act is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and I do expect you to know that phrase. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The NAAQS. So I might abbreviate it as NAAQS. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So one important part of the Clean Air Act is the setting of these National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So what the National Ambient Air Quality Standards are doing is they're setting emission levels. They're setting basically legal emission levels for what we consider to be our hazardous air pollutants. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standards basically says this is what you can do. This is the standard. So Clean Air Act's going to regulate a certain number of hazardous air pollutants and what's allowable. Yeah.
So these are like the laws of the regulation of the Clean Air Act.
I'm going to literally show you kind of what they're tracking. So just give me a second. I think it'll make more sense. Okay. So right here, guys, this is the things that we're tracking in the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. I didn't update it since from 2013 rather, but you guys get the idea. Now, because I don't want you to write all this down, I've actually printed for you some of the slides, and so you're going to, as you take notes, want to reference these slides right here. But let's take a look at the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So, we've got carbon monoxide, we've got lead, we've got nitrogen oxides, we've got volatile organic compounds. PM stands for what? What do you guys know? Science guys, what do you know? PM.
Particulate matter.
Particulate matter. Somebody explain to my students what we mean by particulate matter. What's particulate matter? Brandon, what's particulate matter?
I had to think about that one for a second.
Okay, Sandy, what's particulate matter?
I mean, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, like, particulate, like, particle, like, it's super, super tiny in the air.
Particles, little bitty particles suspended in the air. Little bitty particles. Now you can imagine why it's bad for there to be lots of little particles of stuff floating in the air, right? Because what's happening? We're breathing it in, going into our lungs. So particulate matter is going to be the amount of little pieces of stuff that are allowed to be emitted, right? And then you're breathing it in. And then sulfur dioxide. Now again, I'm not a scientist, guys, so I can't give you all the nuts and bolts related to this, but these are the things that we're tracking. Now, what do we see here when we track the data? Over time, at least up till 2013, what are we seeing? We're seeing a decrease in these levels, right? So the whole point here is that we need to have some ambient air quality standards that govern what you can emit, and we can choose to tighten those up over time. We can combine them with other regulations. For example, let's look at lead. We've seen a big decrease in lead. What might have contributed to that? Anyone know? Ryan? Paint?
Unleaded
So we
gasoline.
have seen changes in regulations for paint, but something probably that's going to have a bigger impact. When you go to the gas station, what are you putting in your tank?
Unleaded fuel.
Ah, unleaded fuel. Well, has it ever occurred to you, like, why are they calling it unleaded fuel? Why don't they just call it fuel? Why is it unleaded gas and not just gas? Why?
Because there's no lead in it.
Well, because it used to be leaded, right? It used to be leaded. So, guys, when I was a kid, you guys grew up with unleaded gas. When I was a kid, it was leaded gas. I don't know what the advantage of leaded gas over unleaded gas would be, but cars are a huge source of mobile pollution, right? So if cars are a big source of mobile pollution and they're burning leaded fuel, guess what? What goes into the atmosphere? The lead, right? So we've seen some big decreases in this, so that's the good news, right? All right. So this is an interesting graph here, and I realize that on your handout it's very small, so you might want to take some notes here and make sure, because it's going to be a little difficult to read it on what I've given you. But what are we looking at over time? What's cool about this graph? Right, economists work with a lot of graphs, and sometimes they can get really messy. What's cool about this graph? What's cool about this graph, guys?
It
Let's
shows
see.
multiple different factors.
Yeah, it's tracking a whole lot of things in one graph. And has it done it fairly clearly? Yeah, it's really clear, right? So this is a great example of, for those of you guys that are in upper level econ and you're going to start having to move in the direction of doing your senior theses, and you're going to have these messy graphs, you have to be clever and figure out, how do I make a graph really readable but show a bunch of things on one graph and make it efficient? So what are we tracking on the horizontal axis?
The year.
Here. So we're looking at these things: GDP, vehicle miles traveled, population, energy consumption, CO2 emissions, and aggregate emissions of the 6 common pollutants over time for a period of, what is it? Looks like 33 years on this graph. All right, so let's start with GDP. What do we see is happening to GDP? GDP is growing. All right, so we're trying to say, look, we've got more and more economic activity in our country, as represented by GDP going up, right? Now we know it's not a smooth upward trend, right? Do we see some bobbles, right? Do we see some decreases? Yeah, where's that decrease in that blue line for GDP?
Recession.
Ah, not just the recession, we've got a lot of recessions. What recession? What we call the Great Recession, right? The Great Recession. And why do we call it the Great Recession? To distinguish it from all the other recessions, guys. I'm 50-something years old. I've lived through a lot of recessions, and that was a really, really big one, hence the Great Recession. All right, so the Great Recession. And I realize it's really the only one that you kind of can recognize, that you felt, you saw the effects of. All right, what about vehicle miles traveled? What's happening to vehicle miles traveled? Yeah, it's going up. Now, it's a little flat, right? I mean, it's certainly an upward trend, though. So we're seeing an increase in the amount of miles driven. Why is that interesting to put on this graph? Why is that interesting to put on this graph?
The CO2 emissions are
Because
going down.
we want to look at how that connects to some of the other things. CO2 emissions, for example. We're traveling more. We have more cars. We are traveling more, yet CO2 emissions, they were kind of flat, and then look at the green line, they started to do what? Started to decrease, right? So that's a good thing. What about energy consumption? What can we take away from energy consumption in red? It's been a little flat, but then a little dip down, right? So maybe we're focusing a little bit more on energy conservation, being a little bit more careful. We have more efficient construction of our houses, right? More efficient appliances, for example. Okay. But then if we look at the very bottom, the dark green is our aggregate emissions from our 6 common pollutants, which I'm sure overlaps with the National Ambient Air Quality Standard emissions that we just looked at. And what do we see? Downward trend. So guys, what's the punchline here? If you had to create a punchline out of this graph, what's the punchline? What's the punchline?
It's showing that we've obtained more efficient ways because population and vehicles and GDP has all gone up.
All right. While population is going up, and while we're driving more on the road, either we're all driving more or we have more cars on the road or some combination of both, and while economic activity is going up, and right, economic activity takes energy, production takes energy, while those things are going up, we have achieved some reduction in our overall emissions. So is our environment getting cleaner or dirtier? It's getting cleaner, but do you hear that a lot? No, I don't think you really hear that. Now, I'm not at all trying to say we're clean enough, we should stop. I'm not saying it shouldn't be cleaner at this point. I'm just saying we don't tend to hear the news about, hey, the environment's getting cleaner. We do still have a lot of work to do, though. But this is at least some good news. All right, so let's summarize the Clean Air Act's goals. All right, let's summarize the goals of the Clean Air Act. Well, one of these you're probably already familiar with. We want to reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide, and would that be called nitrous oxide? Nitrous oxide? I think I've got that right. It's been a long time since my chemistry days. I actually started out as a chemistry major. I was about to say it's a long story how I became an economist. It was really not. Took a class, liked it. How probably a lot of you picked ECON or whatever you picked. All right, so we want to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions and nitrous oxide that causes acid rain. All right, seems like a good objective, right? What does acid rain do? Why do we care about acid rain? Say again? Okay, it creates a lot of problems for anything built out of metal. What's one big thing that's built out of metal that we know has needed a big facelift because of acid rain? The Statue of Liberty, right? Anyone remember we had to give the Statue of Liberty a really big facelift because she was deteriorating. Why? She's made of metal, and sulfur dioxide emissions, nitrous oxide emissions causes problems. All right, we'll talk more about that. We need to reduce air pollutants such as particulate matter and the things we just mentioned. All right, particulate matter. What do we say particulate matter is, guys? Particulate matter? PM? Particulate matter? Little particles, right? And they kind of divided, I think, into size of particles, but little particles that are suspended in the air, and we breathe them in. All right, so we want to reduce air pollutants such as particulate matter and the other things, all right? And guys, these can reduce visibility across large regional areas. And so one thing the Clean Air Act acknowledges is that, look, we need to reduce these emissions because acid rain's a problem and visibility is a problem. If you've ever been to a really, really polluted place, you can see it. You go to China on some days. I was lucky. I went to the Great Wall of China on a day that it was unusually clear. But usually it's very foggy and hazy. And it's not fog like from weather, it's haze from pollution. Yeah?
Does it smell?
Does it smell? Well, it's kind of hard to distinguish the smell of just China from the smell of the air. Yes, I'm not really sure. Some of these places have a lot of, different smells. They don't, some of these places, municipal garbage isn't handled quite the same way. In areas where you have more homelessness, you might have some smells. So I don't know. I don't remember a smell from that, but there's lots of interesting smells when you travel in the developing world. Now, another thing that acknowledges is that we know that these types of emissions are having an effect on the nation's most treasured parks and wilderness areas. So guys, we don't need to get every word here down, but we need to clean this stuff up because it contributes to acid rain and it has an effect on visibility and our parks and our wilderness. What is it doing? Somebody help me understand this. What does acid rain have to do with parks and wilderness?
Lowers the pH of water systems.
Okay, lowers the pH of water systems, but why is that a bad thing? It affects the ecosystems, and what happens when we have high levels of acid rain in some of these more pristine areas? What happens? Can they survive? Are they healthy? No. If you go to Germany and you go to the Black Forest, you will see areas of the Black Forest that are completely dead. Why? Acid rain. They've had a huge problem. Yeah.
What exactly is acid rain?
All right, let's talk about acid rain. One of you science people want to give us the 60-second lesson on acid rain?
I think it's just when those pollutants are in the air and they get caught in the rain droplets.
So it changes, basically, my understanding is kind of changes in a sense the chemical composition of water. And that water has, as you said, a different pH level. And, if you have something that's alkaline and it switches to basic, right, that's a very big change in the composition of the water. And it's not good for lakes and the water life, fish, all those things. It's not good for the trees, the forests. It creates a huge amount of erosion on buildings, oxidizes metal. So it really has a lot of negative effects. So we hear about acid rain all the time, but we never really think about all the impacts that it can have. Now, another thing, and again, lots of words, don't get them all in here, but the Clean Air Act acknowledges that these sources of toxic air can lead to cancer and other adverse human health. So we've talked about acid rain, we've talked about visibility, we've talked about the health of our parks and forests, and now we're talking about addressing risks for cancer and adverse human health effects. So guys, if you're writing every word down, that is super, super silly. Okay? So that makes sense, right? Acknowledging in the Clean Air Act that we have risks to our health when our air isn't very clean. Well, that makes sense. All right? So, again, the next part, and these are pulled from the Clean Air Act, and so some of them seem a little redundant, reducing the risks to public health and the environment. And now we've got limiting the use of chemicals that damage the stratospheric ozone layer in order to prevent increased level of harmful ultraviolet radiation. Okay, that's a lot. What is that really saying, guys? It's a lot of words. What does it really mean?
Control CFCs.
All right, we're controlling CFCs, and we talked about CFCs before. What does CFC stand for? Chlorofluorocarbons. And why do we care about chlorofluorocarbons? It's destroying the ozone layer. What's the ozone layer? It protects us from the harmful rays of the sun, right? So, all you really need to get from this, lots of language from the Clean Air Act, is that, look, we're acknowledging that we have pollutants that destroy the ozone layer. When we destroy the ozone layer, we are more prone to the harmful effects of the sun's radiation, right? So, see, I see there, you writing every word down. You better not be.
No,
This is
no.
a very, very wordy act. And I'm taking their language. Now, that's enough of that. Historically, guys, if we look at our approach to environmental protection, historically, it's been kind of what we call one size fits all. So historically, our approach to environmental protection has been one size fits all. What do you think we mean by that? One size fits all. Mercy, what do you think we mean by that?
I feel like it kind of looks at all the countries and just has, one goal or one approach, whereas
Yeah.
some countries produce more pollution versus others.
Sure. So one size fits all. Everyone do the same thing. All countries do the same thing. All counties, all municipalities, all firms, whatever our entity is. Of course, if we're talking about the Clean Air Act, it wouldn't be different countries, right? Because this is federal legislation for the U.S. But we're going to treat everyone the same. Here's our goal. Everyone go about achieving this goal in the same manner. And so really, if you look historically at early attempts to control outputs and protect our environment, it's been really kind of regulatory in the sense of we're all going to do this. This is how we're doing it. Not flexible, not tailored to specific situations, industries, firms. So in economics, we refer to this as command and control. Command and control. So by command, we mean what, Ryan? Command.
To command the industries to cut back on some of the pollution.
Exactly. So here's the deal. You're going to do this. You're going to cut back. I'm commanding you to do this. This is what we're all going to do. And then control the process by which you're going to do it, right? So command and control. That's what we call our one-size-fits-all type of approach. So if you're in a command and control environment, you've got a situation where regulations and restrictions aren't always tailored to fit the individual situation. They're not always tailored to fit the individual situation. And that's problematic. So they're not always tailored to fit the individual situation. Now, there are pros and cons to this approach. Pros and cons to this approach. So we're all going to do this. We're all going to approach this level. We're all going to do it in the same way. So there's some pros and some cons to that. What might be some advantages to a command and control strategy? We're all going to do this, guys. We're all firm owners. We're all going to do this. We're going to achieve this. This is how we're going to do it. What might be some advantages?
It's easier to keep track of.
Probably easier when it comes to monitoring it, right? A lot easier for me to know if you guys are doing what you're supposed to be doing if everyone's supposed to be doing the same thing, right? So I would imagine there's probably some ease of monitoring, ease of management, ease of implementing these kinds of strategies, right? But the downside might be what? What might be a con? Let's hear from some other people. Trey, what might be a con?
If the one, I guess one regulation you implement in one region, it works for that region, but it doesn't work for another.
Okay, what if we've got regional differences? Good. I've got regional differences and I've developed an approach that might work for the northern region, but maybe it doesn't work for the western region as well. That they really kind of have different needs, need to address pollution in a different way. Maybe I need to set different levels for them. All right? So it doesn't allow us to tailor, to set the optimal regulation for your area. Does it allow you to be creative, do you think? As a firm, does it allow you to be creative? No. If I just tell you what you have to do, there's no creativity involved. But what if I say, look, here's what you need to achieve, and I want you to figure it out. Like, I want you to come up with your way of meeting this mandate. Now I've encouraged you to be creative, efficient. You might come up with solutions that you wouldn't be able to implement under a command and control strategy. All right, so when we talk about command and control, we're usually talking about regulation that comes in the form of these kinds of things. So when I say command and control, what am I meaning? One size fits all kind of things. All right, so ambient standards. Guys, is that a one-size-fits-all kind of regulation? One size fits all? So we just took a look at some things that we track with our national ambient air quality standards. I didn't give you what the standards are because that wouldn't really mean much to us as econ people. But guys, if we all have to meet the ambient standards, is that command and control? Sure. We're all going to meet this standard. This is how much lead you can emit. This is how much particulate matter you can emit. Next, we might have source-specific emissions levels. Source-specific emissions levels. Source-specific emissions levels. So, source-specific emissions levels might be like what? Give me an example of a source-specific emission level. Anyone have one?
Carbon that we release from a factory.
So we might have a specific regulation for factories or for electric utility plants. What about cars? Do we have emission standards for cars? Yeah, we do. So is that command and control? Our emission standards? Yeah, they're command and control. So when we say, look, here's the emission standards for new cars, is that a source-specific emission limit? Yeah. Good. All right. So source-specific emissions limits. Technology requirements. Technology requirements. So what does that sound like we're talking about? Technology requirements. What do you think we're talking about there, Jason? Technology requirements.
The factories, they don't pollute as much.
Okay, but give me what kind of thing might I be talking about? What am I talking about? You're telling me what the goal is, so factories don't pollute as much. But what am I talking about?
Better technology for the factories.
Yeah, not necessarily better, but here is the technology you must implement. So a technology standard is dictating the technology you have to use. So maybe I'm saying, okay, look, all factories with smokestacks have to have a scrubber that pulls the particulate matter out of the air. And that would require you to implement this kind of technology. If you don't have it, you need to. All right, so let's start by talking about ambient standards. When we talk about ambient standards, we're back to this National Ambient Air Quality Standards that we've talked about. So again, we can just get them quickly into our notes. You've already got it on your graph that we looked at earlier, or your chart. But carbon emissions, ozone, lead, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide. So the last one, yes. So this is command and control. These are what we consider to be some of the biggest risks. There's 6 of them right here. Some of the biggest risks to our health, to our forests, to our building structures. And so we've set these national ambient air quality standards. And so guys, this is simply a benchmark that cannot be exceeded. We're setting a benchmark, and that benchmark cannot be exceeded. Command and control, yes or no? Yeah. So guys, sometimes do we need to have a command and control type of strategy? Could you imagine trying to tailor this to different regions, different states, different production processes, right? That would get a little crazy. It would be really difficult to manage this. It would be very difficult to monitor it. So we do have some command and control, very important command and control regulation in place here. Now, here's the thing though, when we talk about our ambient standards, is that cost is not supposed to enter the decision process of the criteria for setting the standard. It's a lot of words, but basically we're just saying we can't factor cost in to deciding what the level should be. We can't look at cost. When I say cost, guys, whose cost am I talking about? What cost am I talking about? So when I say cost, what do I mean?
The cost of adding new technology.
All right, it could be the cost of adding new technology for the firm. What other way might I be using cost? What other way? What was that?
Employees to.
I might have to hire more employees. Another cost to the firm. What other way am I thinking about cost?
Like switching to substitutes.
I might have to switch to alternatives in my production process. And so that could become a cost for my firm. What else? What's another way? So we're talking about production costs, cost to the firm. Is there any other way of thinking about cost? What was that? Okay, there's time costs. But guys, I guess my question is, do all costs fall to the producers? What other costs might I be thinking about? Rising prices, right? Guys, if we start mandating things and firms have more, you guys said might have to hire more employees, you might have technology you need to implement, you might have to switch, substitute towards different kinds of inputs. Is that a cost that 100% stays with the firm? What are they going to do?
Subsidize.
They're going to subsidize?
They gonna give.
They're going to raise prices. So what are they doing? When we say they raise prices, they're passing some of that cost on to who? To you and me as the consumer, right? Now, what did we learn with respect to green taxes? That firm's ability to pass the cost on to us depends on what? Our elasticity, right? So let's think about what we've learned. If this is a good that is highly inelastic, then who's going to pay the majority of that cost? The consumer, right? They're going to be able to pass that cost forward. Why? I can't substitute away very easily. I can't switch. But if it's something that's highly elastic, what do we know? The firm is going to absorb a larger share, right? So when we talk about that cost is not supposed to enter into the decision process, we're talking about the portion that the firms pay, the portion that consumers pay, right? That generally these costs are going to be split between producers and consumers. Good. So guys, if cost isn't supposed to be a factor, then how do we decide what these ambient air quality levels should be? Sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, lead. How do we decide? It's going to be based on probably science, right? Scientific studies. Okay, well that makes sense. But cost is certainly relevant, right, when we think about the impact that it could have on industries. But basically the air quality, the Clean Air Act is basically saying, look, science is going to dictate these levels. It's going to be based on health to our environment, our ecosystems, whatever, and we're not going to get into this business of saying, oh, this is going to get expensive. It's going to get expensive. But as economists, we know it does, right? It does get expensive, and that affects producers and you and me as consumers. So make sure you've gotten some good notes about that. All right. The only thing, guys, that the Clean Air Act allows to be thought about is if large segments of an industry would be, that should be say, driven into bankruptcy. So we can only think about costs if we can argue that, hey, look, the effects are so detrimental that we're going to drive a segment of our industry into bankruptcy. Then we can say, look, we need to think about this. So that makes some sense, right? What we're basically saying is if the effects of this, if the cost of this are going to fall so targetedly to one industry that it's going to be detrimental to that industry, that we're going to create job loss, huge job loss in that industry, then we can have a conversation. Then we can start thinking about if we're setting the right target. Does that make sense? But in general, if the costs are fairly spread out, then cost isn't going to be relevant. All right. Now, have we heard this before, guys? Yeah, with the Endangered Species Act, right? So if you remember, we have other legislation that works like this. With the Endangered Species Act, we talked about that you are not allowed to talk about the costs associated with protecting a species. That we don't get to sit around the table and say, oh, that Arkansas fat bucket, it's going to be really, really expensive for us to save. You don't get to decide not to list the Arkansas fat bucket because it's going to be super, super expensive. Unless protecting that species is going to drive an industry out of business. For example, We've seen some case studies related to the, gosh, was it spotted owl, I think it was? The spotted owl, which was on the endangered species list. I might have the wrong variety of owl, but I think it was a spotted owl. Maybe there's a speckled owl. I don't know the difference. Anyway, some owl on the endangered species list, and as a result, loggers were hugely affected. And that became this kind of interesting case study that to protect the owl, we were really decimating a region's logging industry. So then we got to figure out what to do. All right. Basically, though, guys, for the economists, do you agree that when we can't think about costs, then we start getting worried about efficiency, right? We like efficiency. Economists like efficiency. So if we're going to have an act that says costs cannot be thought about, the bells start going off for the economists, right? Because we're like, well, ding, 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 hold on a second. Then how do we know what we're doing makes sense from an efficiency standpoint? So remind me, guys, what do we mean by efficiency here? When we say we like efficiency, we want to have things be efficient. What do we mean? We use that term all the time. Can you tell me what it means? The biggest bang for our buck. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about efficiency. Biggest bang for our buck. We want to make sure for whatever spending level we have, we get the maximum outcome. All right? That's another way of thinking about efficiency. It's another way we use the term efficiency. How do we define it? When we say markets are efficient, what do we mean?
Functioning at the optimal level.
They're functioning at the optimum level. What does that mean? So we like markets. They function at the optimum level. They're efficient. But what does that mean? Right? It's kind of like I've answered a definition with the definition. So efficiency is being optimal. All right. You haven't told me anything yet, so let's dig deeper. What do we mean by efficiency, guys? Nobody has any idea? You just throw the term around in class, but we don't know what it means?
As little cost as possible with as much benefit as possible.
We want to maximize net benefits, right? So Sandy said I want to minimize the cost as much as possible while maximizing the benefits. So do you agree if I'm minimizing costs and I'm maximizing benefits, then I am what? I am trying to maximize the net benefits, right? Maximize the net benefits. So maximizing the net benefits would be a way of thinking about efficiency. See, nobody's pen's moving. But since nobody could define this for me, I would think that you'd be getting some notes down, folks. What's another way of thinking about efficiency? What about allocation of resources? Efficiency requires that resources flow to where what? They're most highly valued, right? They're most highly valued. So we want resources to flow to where they're most highly valued. So those firms that install technologies, we want it to be where they're going to create the most benefits, right? Where they're most highly valued. If we all do it, does it guarantee that we're investing our money where it's most highly valued? No. So if we want efficiency, right, if we want the biggest bang for the buck, we want to maximize net benefits, we want resources to flow, investments to take place to where they're most highly valued, then do we want everyone doing the same thing? We want everyone doing the same thing? Does that make sense? Everyone do the same thing? Does that give us minimum cost, maximum benefit? Definitely not, right? Definitely not. So you can see why this idea of kind of one size fits all is concerning from an efficiency standpoint, right? Not being able to think about costs is concerning to economists from an efficiency standpoint. All right. Do you agree, guys? If we don't have to think about efficiency, if we're not allowed to think about efficiency, we're not allowed to think about costs versus benefits, then could it result in a higher price tag for cleanup? Could cleanup be more expensive than it might be otherwise? Sure. So we might not be minimizing the cost of cleanup. when we can't think about costs and benefits and efficiency, right? So guys, command and control. Do you think it's going to achieve an outcome with the least cost involved? Least cost? Is it going to be what I'm going to call a least cost approach? Is it going to be a least cost approach? Yeah, probably not, right? In some cases it could be, but probably generally not going to be the least cost way of achieving our outcome, right? All right, so let's take a look at a very simple graph. Let's take a look at a simple graph. Now, before we start just drawing this willy-nilly and memorizing this, it's not art, right? We need to make sure we understand it. So, what are we measuring on the horizontal axis? Emissions, okay? Emissions. And we're measuring everything as dollar values, right? So, what are we saying about marginal damage, which would be the incremental effect on health, on ecosystems, and whatever from our emissions? We're saying that our damage, our marginal cost associated with damage, as we have more emissions, does what? Increases, right? But the marginal cost associated with generating those emissions is going down, right? So if we think about this from a simple cost-benefit type of analysis, which is what we've got here, right? And you don't have this in your notes, so you need to kind of quickly sketch this into your notes and make sure that you understand. So let's take a look at this really quick. So everyone get this graph. So what we're basically saying is that all locations are being treated the same here. We're putting everybody onto one graph. We're aggregating across all of the different locations, treating it this way. I'm going to look at all emissions, all costs of control. And when we do this kind of graph, we're kind of assuming that the costs are the same for everybody. Does that make sense? So again, we're not trying to cover too much here, but we're basically saying when we draw these kinds of cost-benefit graphs, and we're talking about emissions, when we reduce the world to a single graph like this, we're assuming that everybody's costs are the same and everybody's marginal damage is the same. Is that true? Is that a reasonable assumption? It's not. It's not. All right? So you see a lot of these types of graphs in a standard environmental econ textbook. We didn't use a standard environmental econ textbook because that way I could talk about what I wanted to talk about and we wouldn't be just crunching through graph after graph after graph because you would see a lot of this. But this has some very built-in assumptions, right? Which suggest, hey, command and control. But it doesn't help us understand the inefficiencies here. So, marginal cost of reducing emissions is not the same for all operations, and the marginal damage is not the same for all. All right? So we really want to be concerned about the efficient use of resources, right? We want, if people are going to have to invest a lot of money into equipment and changing their technology and cleanup strategies, we care about use of the resources. We want resources to be used efficiently. So we just talked about what we mean by efficiency. Biggest bang for the buck, generating the biggest net benefits, right? So this is the way that economists think. And it makes sense, guys, because do you agree with me? Pollution abatement's very expensive. This is not a cheap endeavor. If you're a firm and you have to pay the cost of pollution abatement, do you agree this is going to be a sizable price tag? This is an expensive activity. So to undertake a very expensive activity but not guarantee that we're doing it in the most efficient way doesn't make sense for a lot of economists. Because we're talking about a lot of money. All right? So, of course, when there's no concept of cost versus benefit, that starts to make us nervous as economists. So when we use this kind of approach, we're not applying any kind of cost versus benefit strategy. And guys, do you remember back at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about the tools that economists like? And one of them was cost-benefit analysis, right? Because it helps promote efficiency. All right, you guys get that. So let's move on to talk about source-specific emissions limits. So we've just been talking about kind of ambient standards, which we've agreed are command and control. So make sure you understand, because that was a lot of slides. All of that was related to the ambient standards, where ambient standards are command and control, right? Where ambient standards don't weigh costs and benefits. They simply ask everyone to do the same thing. It's not necessarily a model of efficiency, but we might not be able to do it realistically any other way. You can imagine a world when we had, instead of national ambient air quality standards, we had state level air quality standards. That would be messy. All right. So let's move to source-specific emissions. So we've already mentioned what this is. It's the idea of applying emission limits for individual sources. So what were some of the examples we used? Factories having a smokestack. Emissions are coming out of that. What was another example? Cars, right? Cars. So applying emission limits for individual sources. But again, not on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, okay? So generally when we build in these kinds of standards, when this is the kind of regulation we use, again, it's more like the ambient air quality standards, not using cost-benefit. But here's one kind of exception, is that sometimes in our regulation, we look at existing sources of pollution differently than new sources of pollution. We look at existing sources of pollution differently than new sources of pollution. So what in the world would I be talking about? Existing sources of pollution versus new sources of pollution. Let's hear from some other people. CJ, new sources versus existing sources. Give me an example of what we might be talking about here.
Just saying something that's like just come up in the past couple of years.
Okay.
Which is something that's like been happening for.
All right, so we might be talking about maybe a factory that's 50 years old versus what?
A new one.
A new factory, good. So we've got some factories that are old versus a factory that's brand new. Guys, should we treat them the same? Would it make sense for us to say, hey, new factories, you got to do this. You got to do X, Y, Z. But older factories, you do A, B, C. That'd be fair, right? That'd be fair. Would it be okay for us to hold new factories to a different standard, maybe a higher standard? Because they have access to new technology. They're just now implementing new technology. They're designing their factories, sure. So we do see some tailoring, but very little is the point that I'm trying to make. I'm not trying to say that it's not at all, thoughtful at all about trying to tailor the standards, but for the most part, they are command and control. All right? So make sure you have in your notes that a good example of this would be an old factory versus a new factory. And they'll have different standards, potentially, under source-specific emissions limits. All right? Now, as you can imagine, guys, there are some disadvantages here. There are some disadvantages of this type of strategy, some disadvantages, and some inefficiencies. So if I were to ask you guys to explain to me the potential for inefficiency, could you do it? Could you do it? Could you do it? Would it be like the discussion we just had related to ambient standards? What was that? So how would you explain this to me? When I say there could be inefficiencies, what are we talking about? How would you explain this to me? If I gave you an essay on this, on a test, what are the potential inefficiencies? Graham?
I do not know.
Okay, well, we just covered this. So who's going to answer this for me, guys? Come on. We just talked about this with ambient standards, which we said were command and control. All we're doing is the same thing, but we're looking at source specific. So we're going to have this kind of regulation for factories. We're going to have this kind of regulation for cars. Take a step.
I mean, the factories won't like if they like.
Ryan.
So cars probably create more pollution than other sources of pollution, like factories. Big factories, of course, will probably make more pollution. Small ones will make less. So that's like when it comes into source specific, like where is the pollution coming from?
Okay,
how
I need to
much?
really think about where's the pollution coming from. What else should I think about? Are all places as polluted? So if your factory's rural and Brandon's factory is in the city, do they have the same impact? No. Am I allowed to think about that as I decide what you're going to do? No. So is it possible that the marginal cost each of your factories imposes on the environment are different? But can I factor that in? No. Now what if Brandon's factory would be really costly to clean up, but Ryan's factory, which is right next to it, is cheap to clean up? Would it might make sense to concentrate cleanup in one of the firms and not the other? Sure, but am I allowed to think about that? No. So guys, can you talk intelligently about why there might be inefficiencies associated with this kind of approach? You better be able to. All right. So if we have a situation, guys, where existing firms have higher marginal cost of pollution abatement, then we might have a situation that's not efficient, right? What if the old firms have a lower marginal cost? What if the lower marginal cost cleaner-uppers, to say it that way, what if the lower cost cleaner-uppers are the old firms? Who do we want cleaning up?
The cheap brands.
Whoever can do it cheaper. And what if the lower cost cleaner-uppers are the new firms? Then we want the new firms doing more of the cleanup. But do we think that way, guys? No. So let's go back to this graph right here, because y'all are kind of missing the point. When we look at this, we're treating everybody the same, right? We're treating everybody's marginal cost structure the same. We're treating everyone's marginal damage structure the same, right? Is that realistic? No. If everybody's the same, then does command and control work? Yeah, if everyone's identical, then command and control's fine. Let's do that. It's easier to manage, it's easier to monitor. If we're all identical, if all factors are identical, then let's do that. But didn't we just say that's not how things really work in the real world? So there's lots of examples of how we're not the same. Brandon's firm might be high cost for cleaning up. Ryan's firm might be lower cost for cleaning up. But now we're going to ask them to do the same. Brandon's firm might have a very big impact because his is in a city. Ryan's firm might be very low impact because it's rural. But we're going to ask them to do the same thing. You guys with me here? So we need to think more specifically. All right. So let's move on to talk about technology standards. Are you kind of getting the hang of this, what I'm talking about, with these command and control strategies and how they build in inefficiencies? We're going to talk about some regulation that addresses it and kind of offsets it. Technology standards. When we talk about technology standards, we're talking about where a regulation specifies techniques or equipment that have to be used. So if we're talking about a technology standard, we're talking about a regulation that says you have to have this technique, you have to have this equipment. And that's how you're going to control pollution. So again, command and control. Is this command and control, guys? Yeah, it's command and control. Is it tailored specifically to your firm's individual situation? No. All right? So when I say command and control, we're not tailoring it to you. We're not looking at your cost structure, the marginal cost, the marginal benefits of you implementing this technology. I'm not looking if Ryan doesn't really benefit, the environment doesn't get a lot cleaner when we do it for him, but it does for Brandon. Doesn't matter, I'm going to treat them all the same. All right? So here are some examples. And we've already talked about this first one, a ban on lead gasoline. All right, so guys, all of you producers of gasoline, here's the deal. We're going to do this. Now, it was a good idea, right? What did we see when we looked at our graph? Has this been successful in terms of cleaning up the environment? Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm not saying command and control doesn't generate favorable results. What we're saying is what? Because clearly, this is favorable. We have seen a huge decrease in lead. So what am I saying? It's not necessarily done in the most efficient manner, meaning what? Meaning what, guys? So we've reduced lead emissions, but an economist doesn't just look at, hey, has lead emissions gone down? Is the amount of lead in the air gone down? They look at what? The costs and benefits, right? And whether we've done it in what? The most efficient manner, meaning
If we've maximized our benefits.
maximize our benefits relative to our costs, maximize our net benefits, done it in the least cost manner. Does that make sense? Y'all need to be able to articulate what we mean when we say this is efficient. So, here's an example of a command and control strategy that is a technology standard, and it's been beneficial. I'm not trying to say that these regulations all stink because they're not tailored, but it's not clear that it necessarily was done in the least cost manner that maximized net benefits. All right? Here's another one. The use of catalytic converters in cars. We've mandated the use of catalytic converters. Now, I'm not a car chick. I barely know what a catalytic converter is, but I do know that it reduces emissions. All right, has that been beneficial? I'm guessing so. So again, I'm not trying to say that anytime we have a command and control technology standard that it's bad. Clearly this has been favorable. But the economist might want to know, has this resulted in the biggest bang for the buck? We don't know that. All right. There might also be mandates that can only be met in one way. If you have a mandate, it can only be met in one way, then we're also talking about something we would consider to be a technology standard. So if you have a mandate, you can only meet it in one way. For example, let's say that we're going to reduce emissions and it can only be achieved by installing scrubbers. So we give you a mandate. We don't say you have to use scrubbers. Does that make sense to everyone? We give you a mandate. We're going to get to 90% of the required level instead of 100% of the required level. But the only way your firm can do that, and firms in general in your industry can do that, are by installing scrubbers in your smokestack. And those scrubbers are like the size of this room and they pull out the particulate matter. It's expensive. Is that in a sense a technological standard, guys? Is that a technology standard? I didn't tell you you had to use smokestacks, but I know it's the only way you can do it. You know it's the only way you can do it. Does that make sense to everyone? So it's not explicitly saying buy smokestacks. I'm just giving you a mandate that's going to require you to install, scrubbers in your smokestack. All right? So, that example clear to everyone? Okay. The concern here, guys, same kind of concern that we have with the other ambient standards, is that it locks firms into one method of compliance, right? It locks firms into one method of compliance. It locks firms into one method of compliance. Yeah.
So, like for all the technology standards, do they actually mandate that you can only fix it this way, and then sometimes like, you know what I mean?
I'm keeping it a little more simple. So the answer is there's different kinds of technology standards, and we don't want to spend all day talking about this. It's not interesting enough. But basically there are restrictions that kind of tie your hands and limit your ability to be clever, flexible, and do what you think makes the most sense for you. So the concern here for economists is that when we talk about technology standards, it discourages innovation, it discourages technological change because we're mandating something very specific. We're not simply saying, hey, reduce your emissions by this amount. We're saying, you're going to install scrubbers. And that's not the same thing. Clearly, if we tell you that you have to install scrubbers, we're taking away your ability to think outside the box, to be innovative, to try to address this in another way. But guys, do you agree that it's easier to monitor? Easy to monitor? You have to have scrubbers. Can I monitor that? Yeah, scrubbers are big. They're like a big room. So if you have to have scrubbers, I can come to your factory and say, oh, you have a scrubber. All right, check. And that's probably a lot easier than measuring your emissions, am I right? So do you agree that this might make technological standards really desirable? Because if I have to measure your emissions, if I have to try to see if you're meeting the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, I'm collecting data from your emissions. Here, all I have to do is show up and see something, visually inspect, right? So it's really desirable here to use this kind of regulation, especially when testing your emissions can be hard, right? Testing your emissions can be a little bit hard. So let's require catalytic converters on cars, and then we're not going to have to measure every single car's emissions. Though some states do some of that, right? All right, so as we said, the beauty here is that you simply have to inspect. You go to the factory, you look at the cars, they're using catalytic converters, you go to the factories, and they have scrubbers. So you simply inspect at the facility, and I can see if you're in compliance, right? It's very, very easy. Very easy, all right? All right, so guys, we've talked about command and control strategies. Just because they're command and control, does that mean they don't work? If our goal is to clean the environment? No. Clearly we have evidence that they work. What we're concerned about is if we always rely on them, we're not necessarily cleaning up in the most efficient way, right? So you need to make sure that you can articulate to me what we mean by efficiency. When we say efficiently cleaning up the environment, what does that mean? And you need to be able to articulate why, when we talk about command and control, while they might be successful in terms of the outcome, why maybe they don't generate efficiency. Do you feel comfortable that you can do that? Okay. If not, you need to sit and reflect on that a little bit. So I've given you lots of examples. Okay? All right, so let's move on to talk about market-based. And this stuff is now making its way into the Clean Air Act, but it's much more innovative and certainly appealing to economists. So there's been some really interesting innovations, and we call these market-based approaches. So as we said, we're starting to see market-based approaches make their way into EPA legislation, and that's cool. We get really excited about that. So we're starting to see market-based regulation in legislation. So one great example of this is what's called the Tradable Pollution Allowance Program. The Tradable Pollution Allowances. So we're going to talk specifically about tradable pollution allowances. How many of you have heard of that kind of program? You guys in science probably have talked a little bit about it. Okay? So tradable pollution allowances. How many of you have heard about cap and trade? Have heard the terms cap and trade? So again, we're really just talking about tradable pollution allowances. So I'm going to call them tradable pollution allowances. All right. What we want to acknowledge is that this is a major departure from command and control. Are you able to explain to me what I mean by command and control? Does everyone feel like they could explain to me command and control? What makes something command and control? Why we're concerned about command and control? Why command and control may not generate efficiency? Can you give me examples of command and control? We've just gone through a whole lot of different command and control type of regulations. All right. So this is a major departure from command and control. We're seeing something really different, which means it's a very radical change in the way we think about handling air quality. This is really different, a radically different way, because we've been using kind of command and control for a long time. So let's move on to talk about then the specific example that we're interested in, and that's the tradable pollution allowance. All right, the tradable pollution allowance. All right, tradable pollution allowances. Now the thing, guys, that makes this really cool is that we're merging two things that economists like. Property rights, right? We've already talked about at the very beginning of the semester. Private property rights, we like that. And market pricing. So we're merging two of those tools that we talked about that economists like. So let's just quickly review. We talked about property rights. Private property rights set the right incentives, right? Think about it. We talked about that when you have private property rights, you internalize the benefits, right? So we want to go back to that idea that when we have private property rights for something, we internalize the benefits of our behavior. We internalize. So if I do something good, I get to reap the rewards, right? And then market pricing. Why do we like market pricing, guys? Market prices are efficient. What does that mean?
Maximize our benefits.
Okay, it's going to maximize our benefits, but what do we mean when we say market prices are efficient? It guarantees that resources flow where? Where they're most highly valued, right? So market pricing is good because it means we're not going to have shortages, we're not going to have surpluses, we're not going to have resources flowing to where they're not highly valued. All right, so market pricing is good. So these are two of the tools that we like as economists. Now this idea, guys, is not necessarily a new one. It started in 1990 in the Clean Air Act amendments. So the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, we actually implement this cool tradable pollution allowance program that utilizes private property rights and market pricing. The intent of this program was to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions, so SO2 emissions, and specifically from coal burning power plants. So our goal here, the intent, who are we addressing with this program? We're addressing sulfur dioxide emissions from coal burning power plants. Now guys, what are we talking about? Where does your electricity come from?
Cool.
Burning coal, right? And coal, when we burn coal, it releases sulfur dioxide. And why do we dislike sulfur dioxide? Because why?
It goes in the air, particulate matter.
Goes into the air, and it's also associated with acid rain, right? So we don't want a lot of sulfur dioxide emissions. So if you didn't get it into your notes the first time, make sure you get into your notes now that sulfur dioxide contributes to acid rain. It damages trees at high elevation. That's why we're seeing that huge damage in the Black Forest of Germany. Big sections of it dead, and I've seen it with my own eyes. So right here, this is what it looks like. We know that it leads to acidification of lakes and streams, causes problems for the water life, and it accelerates decay of buildings, hence the reason that we needed to give the Statue of Liberty a facelift. So clearly SO2 is something that's problematic. But an important point that we need to make, and probably your notes should be out and you need to be getting this down, is that because of the wind, does the problem stay right by the source? No. So it's important to understand that wind can carry sulfur dioxide for pretty far distances, meaning that we can't just solve the problem that's right next to this lake because the source of the pollution might be really far away from where we're seeing the damage. So sulfur dioxide is a really big problem. So we see this phased in 1995. So 1990 Clean Air Act starts in 1995 in terms of implementation with 110 power plants. 110 power plants. 110 power plants. And these were the firms with the highest emission levels. So this is an interesting experiment. We're targeting something very specific. We're going after sulfur dioxide, and we're targeting the firms that have the highest emissions levels. We're targeting the firms with the highest emissions levels. These 110 power plants, guys, I don't know why your notes are not still out. Your,
12, 16.
okay, well, I'll be done in 1 second, guys. So, located in 21 states. So we're talking about seeing this distributed across a pretty wide geographic area, focusing specifically on the Midwest, Appalachian area, and the northeastern states. So I've provided you with a graph, or rather a map, in your notes that I've passed out, showing you the area that we're going to be targeting. All right? So we need to learn more about the Tradable Pollution Allowance Program. And please read your announcements.